the MMORPG has gained a reputation of being the most intense genre of game, and for good reason. They're competitive, easily the most time-consuming, the most grindy, and combine this with the fact that they never end. It's not uncommon these days for players to have several years of playtime accumulated, with a substantial portion of that time dedicated to items or rewards that would leave most rational people mystified of their obsessiveness. World of Warcraft, being a staple of the genre, is no different, and today we continue our series of videos covering the most unhinged, craziest, obsessed, spectacular, and maybe even the most toxic moments in its history. Before we get into that though, I would like to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, Boot.dev. As you know, I've spent an embarrassing amount of my life grinding levels and chasing upgrades, slowly turning progress bars into my personality. Oh god. But yeah, that's where Boot.dev comes in. It's a platform for learning back-end development through a very hands-on format. Instead of just sitting there passively watching lectures while AFKing in RuneScape in your other monitor, you're actually doing the work while grinding RuneScape in your other monitor. It's done in this cool RPG-inspired way. You're not just writing code, but also earning XP, leveling up, unlocking achievements, and firing up those sweet, sweet dopamine receptors. They teach backend development with stuff like Python, SQL, and Go, and the focus is on learning by building actual projects. If you ever get in trouble, they do have an active Discord community to reach out to, as well as their AI tutor Boots, the Bear Wizard assistant built into the platform. So if you've ever wanted to learn coding and maybe work towards a career that can pay really well and even be done remotely, go to boot.dev and use my code MadSeasonShow to get 25% off your first year on the annual plan. Anyways, a lot of the entries in this series have been rather unwholesome, so let's switch it up and go over something crazy in a more positive light, starting with one of the most hyped and exciting moments in gaming history, which is the build-up and launch of 2019 Classic. When World of Warcraft first launched in 2004, there was of course excitement abound, primarily from those who fell in love with the RTS games. However, it was during a time when the genre was still considered niche, as there had yet to be one that had found this magic formula to bring it into the mainstream. As history has shown, World of Warcraft would be that very game, launching it into this overwhelming amount of popularity, with its golden era for many being the trilogy, which is Vanilla, the Burning Crusade, and, of course, the Wrath of the Lich King. If you ask a player why that is, you get a few different responses. Some will say the actual structure of the game, being that more old-school RPG style. Some will say that it wasn't just the game, but also the world surrounding it. It was back when social media and interacting with other people across the world was this new and exciting thing, and it was fun to get caught up in the wonderment of it all. And others will say it was on a more personal level, with the game being tied closely to this more nostalgic and simple period of their lives. Whatever the case was, it was certainly an interesting time, not just for the game, and not even just for the genre, but social media at large. But as time went on, as all things do, it changes. Not necessarily for the worse. Except that one. That one was actually for the worse, but regardless, it was just different. The game was different, the world was different, the players were different, and so slowly over time, as these three entities strayed further and further away from this golden era, there's this increasing yearning for many to go back to the good old days. So much so that this whole private server microcosm was formed to be the community that would serve these very people. And this itself led to a crazy moment, with Blizzard for years, ever since the Cataclysm, adamantly refuting these players, mainly citing misdirected nostalgia. This, along with one of the most popular private servers, Nostalrius, being dramatically shut down by Blizzard, created this intense backlash and marked the beginning of people souring of one of the most beloved video game developers. However, things changed in 2017, as it was during that year's BlizzCon in November that Blizzard dropped the bombshell of all bombshells. Official Classic World of Warcraft. After years of requests and demands, they finally gave in, having found the necessary data and API off of a backup of an old hard drive. The idea was simple. Although they certainly couldn't recreate the times, they could recreate the game. They advertised vanilla World of Warcraft, released in its 1.12 state as a base, but also with many of its features, such as its dungeons, raids, and items slowly released over time to roughly mimic the cadence of patches rolled out in its original 2004 to 2007 run. The community exploded with excitement, spreading far and wide beyond World of Warcraft itself, but also to gaming communities at large, as the idea of recreating the rise of one of the most popular and beloved games of all time was certainly intriguing. This excitement would only grow over time, especially after the release of the Battle for Azeroth expansion, which had received mixed reviews coming off of the critically acclaimed Legion. There was a certain disillusionment for an amount of players that were eager to try something different and nostalgic, so you sort of had this perfect storm created. Forums and third-party communities buzzed with excitement. There's this highly attractive monotone guy on YouTube pumping out videos like crazy. Blizzard launched alphas and betas and stress tests to determine how many servers to launch with, and this itself would result in memorable events as the world flooded back to the game. But even still, they would woefully underestimate the interest when launch day came, and server queues ballooned to several hours to be able to even log in. And of course, just to be disconnected within 30 minutes, as fans from around the world flocked to be a part of one of the most exciting and interesting moments in the game's history. Shortly after its release, Blizzard would announce that their subscription revenue had tripled, and many years later, this subscription graph revealed just how much of a boon that Classic provided. The game would eventually continue on with the Burning Crusade, along with the level boost, and then later the WoW token, told you so by the way. And today, players are once more experiencing the mystical lands of Pandaria. Not to make you feel old, but August of this year marks the 7th year anniversary of Classic's release, and it's already looked back upon quite nostalgically for those who participated. However, as wholesome as it was, it also came with its fair share of controversy. As mentioned, you can recreate a game as closely as you want, but the people are a different story, and the obvious difference since day one was that the game was no longer new, and with 15 years of experience under their belt, the player base collectively knew the game like the back of their penises. This of course created an entirely different gameplay experience, such as the previously mentioned rank 14 dynamic that we discussed in episode 1, but arguably even greater than that was the world buff meta. Throughout the game, there are these unique stat boosting enhancements to be gained. Some of them are given for grand accomplishments, such as killing certain bosses and turning in a quest item, providing a sizable power boost to everybody in the immediate area is sort of this celebration. You also had the Dire Maul buffs, which are awarded by completing the dungeon without killing any of the patrolling guards, otherwise known as a tribute run. By becoming crowned the new king and talking to the now friendly guards, they'll enhance the players in various ways. There's also Songflower, which is a shorter 1-hour buff that can be found throughout the Felwood zone. This is just one of a handful of useful plants in the zone, although certainly the most sought after due to the power it provides. And the list goes on. In 2004 to 2007 culture, these were designed and experienced quite innocently. Just small little enhancements to happen upon to provide a boon to ease the leveling, or maybe you got lucky and you took it into your next dungeon run. On a rare occasion, guilds would sometimes maybe hold the Onyxia head buff before heading out, if it was convenient, but that was about it. However, it wasn't the mid-2000s anymore, and as time has progressed and the players became more and more knowledgeable, these world buffs would be one of the many aspects of the game that would become hyper-optimized to crazy levels. By coordinating server-wide quest turn-ins and setting up these intricate summoning networks, it was now very possible to go across the entire world and stacking all of these different enhancements, which, when combined, transformed them from just nice little bonuses to have to completely game-changing power boosts. And it was all possible because of one reason. The timers didn't run out when the player was logged off, so by carefully logging in at very specific times, usually coordinated through Discord, it slowly became the standard for raiding, with many guilds incentivizing them through performance-based loot consoles, or even sometimes just straight up requiring them to raid. And since the developers, of course, hadn't envisioned such a massive coordinated effort from the player base, the entire balance of the endgame raiding was thrown off. This was an issue that was first introduced with everybody's increased knowledge and skill, particularly in the early tiers. The once challenging and ultra difficult achievements that players remembered from the mid-2000s culture was missing entirely. From the no changes movement that was discussed in the previous episode, the raids were largely untouched, with the bosses holding the same amount of health, dealing the same damage, and having the same mechanics from their 1.12 state. They had nothing to compensate for the more experienced player base, which made them even easier than your mom. But not only that, going into them with over 50% chance to crit from these world buffs, they went from easy to completely trivial. And so the challenge changed from completing the raids to completing them as efficiently and as quickly as possible. It became something of a game of how fast that they could be completed and how well players could parse on third-party tracking websites with leaderboards. And while that itself is one thing, it did unfortunately have what some would say were toxic and negative effects. The raiding environments often became quite tense, as wipes, which still did occur, were no longer just res and run back. It was a loss of the combined efforts of 40 people going through all of this effort of stacking 20 different world buffs. And since the parsing culture had overtaken the game at this point, wiping would be quite the mood killer for the rest of the raid. Anyone who played 2019 and was a part of this culture will remember many awkward silences and people just fuming if someone simply made a mistake that resulted in the raid wiping.
When I say, what's your fucking KTM? What's your KTM? Stupid fucking melee, man. That's literally like 5 to 10 minutes now, by the way. That's lost right here, because you stupid Swedish fucking warriors can't stop DPS.
It created some awkward dynamics with progression, as there still was difficulty to be had, particularly in the later stages of AQ40 and Next Ramus, as now, every time I raid wiped, it wasn't simply a matter of running back and trying again. Oftentimes it would be everybody hearth back to a major city, get an Nixie ahead, coordinate a ZG drop, have somebody run tribute, get a summoning network going, maybe Songflower if you had the time, which created sometimes hour-long gaps in between attempts, where again, this tense atmosphere is created because there's so much pressure to get the kill, because if you fail, you're facing another hour of recollecting world buffs. At first, it supported raid logging. As mentioned, the timers would freeze when you're offline, and sometimes, depending on your server and the coordination, you really couldn't guarantee head drops or ZG buffs or war chiefs on certain days and times. So ideally, you'd want to get them as early in the raiding week as possible, which, at the very best, if you're successful, you couldn't play your fucking character. This became so bad that, in the later stages of vanilla, Blizzard would introduce the Chrono Boon, which allowed players to freely store and reapply their world buffs, but it came rather late in Vanilla's lifespan, and only after the no changes crowd relented and realized that perfectly recreating the game in 2019 culture is ultimately meaningless. Next is, and this is largely exclusive to PvP servers, but it also created the Dispel meta, which is either fun or toxic, depending on your point of view. But some of these world buffs were classified as magic, and there are two classes in the game that can dispel magic buffs: the Priest and the Shaman. For some of the more toxic players, it became something of a game itself to stock and dispel raiders gathering these buffs and forcing them to start over. Some were extremely, dedicated, I guess you could say.
Get fucked! Oh, get fucked, idiot! Get fucked! Get fucked! Get fucked! Get fucked!
Creating these collaborative discords to report the locations of certain guilds or players that made it on their shit list, while the most extreme would even set up multi-boxing accounts to camp multiple spots at once. Some of the buffs were just toxic to get in general, especially on PvP servers, of course. Particularly for the Alliance, there's the incredibly powerful but Horde-specific buff called War Chief's Blessing, which you get from a quest turning in Rend Blackhand's head. The problem is that only players in the Horde capital, Orgrimmar, or the Populous Barons will receive it, which you have to get around by either having a second account in order to mind control yourself, or just have a Horde friend do it.
I got it. Oh my god. That was clutch. Thank you for moving.
That itself is highly annoying, but at the end of the day, it's still manageable on PvE servers. However, on PvP, in order to avoid being killed or dispelled, you'd have to find all of these different hiding spots and out-of-bounds areas. And then the dispellers would find that area, and then log in when the buff was dropping, until you had to find another spot. Inevitably, that spot would be found out. And you can say all of this is a choice, which is true, if you weren't in a guild that, again, didn't handle loot based off of performance. But even then, without that, there's this sort of peer pressure of wiping on progression, which, again, still happened. And of course, being the guy who didn't get the 10 different world buffs and the recreation of a fucking 15-year-old video game would be the one dragging down the other raid members who did put in the effort. This was largely due to the no changes approach that the players requested of Blizzard, and one of the many ways that it ironically had a huge effect on how different that they experienced it compared to the original run. And like I said, Blizzard did eventually break their inaction with changes like the Chrono Boon, which solved the issues of raid logging and helped with the dispel meta. People are in disagreement if it was really toxic or not. Some people find it interesting, which is fair, but what is inarguable is that the entire world buff meta and the whole dynamic of the game and how it affected it was definitely one of the craziest moments in its history. It was so intense, in fact, that it led to some, altercations that were rather interesting. There certainly wasn't a shortage of spice in the 2019 run, but the most concentrated was most certainly on the server Fairlina, which was a server that all of the streamers chose to flock to.
You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy.
This attracted not only their communities, but also those who disliked them and made it their goal to hunt them down.
Oh, you want to fuck me? There you go.
And with it being a PvP server, it was quite the rowdy crowd, to say the least, but also quite memorable. And one of the many memorable moments was the Mushroom War. This is related somewhat to the World Buff section, but outside of the final raid tier of the game, Nixramis, in the Eastern Plague Lands, there are these giant cosmetic mushrooms, and these are important because either through some tricky jumping or straight up teleport hacks that Blizzard did nothing about, it was possible to get on top of them, and with them being so close to the entrance of the raid, they were quite a popular spot to raid log and store characters until raid night came, at which point players could simply slow fall down to the entrance with minimal risk of getting dispelled. Since they were quite good spots, that of course meant that there was competition for them, and certain guilds would claim dominance over these individual mushrooms, until one day, inevitably, a guild of a rival faction challenged the ownership of one said mushroom and staged a stakeout where, if anyone of the opposing faction were to attempt to gain entry, they would either be dispelled or killed. The original owners of this mushroom didn't take kindly to this, and so they called on all of their members to retake control of the fabled god mushroom, at which point the trespassers called on the aid of allied guilds to retake control, and in the process of doing this, that allied guild took post on another mushroom that was claimed by another guild of the opposite faction, which essentially started this three-way war of sorts with 4 different guilds fighting for control over 2 different mushrooms. Eventually, as it always tends to go on PvP servers, the situation escalated, and before long, every single mushroom near the raid were in contention. Several guilds were warring against each other, holding vigils that lasted through the night. Some took to advertising and trade chat for additional faction support, and just random people curious were intrigued enough to join the mayhem until this standoff was reached, where everybody just kind of awkwardly stared at each other from across the mushrooms until the other side got tired or bored enough to leave. Eventually, everyone forgot what they were originally fighting for, and the situation went on for over a week until players eventually realized that it was a complete waste of time, and they moved on with their lives. However, leaving in their wake just one of the many highly interesting moments in the history of the Fairlina server. As is tradition with this series, we're gonna take a little field trip and sneak in a non-World of Warcraft item to conclude it. And this relic takes us all the way back to the MMO that some say started it all, and that's EverQuest.
It is the adventure of quest that awaits the bold and daring. It is the land of EverQuest.
The predecessor to World of Warcraft, it did directly inspire many of the latter's now iconic systems, and at its base it was a fairly similar experience. You level up through a numbered, mostly linear leveling system, and at the end game you group up with many players to defeat tough bosses, serving as one of the very earliest pioneers of this basic structure of the MMORPG genre. But one of these many iconic bosses was special, and that's Karafurim the Sleeper, because unlike most others, this one was designed to be undefeatable. Karafurim could be found in the Sleeper's Tomb, which was a high-end dungeon containing 4 raid bosses known as the Warders, with Karafurim hidden away behind them. In EverQuest lore, he was this forbidden child, born from 2 rival dragon bloodlines. He was said to be so dangerous that he threatened the gods themselves, causing him to be sealed away. And when the players killed all 4 of the Wardens, he could be awakened, at which point he would then kill everybody within the tomb, and then go on this rampage across the world as this one-time world event. You couldn't farm him, there were no second chances, and on most servers that's exactly what happened, until one day, something interesting happened. There's one server in particular called Ralosek, where Karafurim still slept. One of the reasons for that was that this was a PvP server, so players had not only the raid bosses to contend with, but also other competing guilds, which certainly complicated the situation. 3 major guilds dominated the server in this constant state of war. They would sabotage each other, form alliances, break the alliances, in this sort of Game of Thrones-esque dramatic plot line. And the issue is that waking Karafurim would permanently remove the Warders, which would otherwise constantly respawn holding valuable loot. So it was in the best interest of the server to avoid awakening him. And unlike other servers, Ralosek had this treaty to where none of the top guilds would try to go awaken him, so that they could farm the valuable Wardens over and over. Waking the Sleeper was entirely optional, and the only reason to do it is to take part in an interesting one-time server event. And so this agreement stayed for a while, until inevitably, because it's the internet, it would eventually be broken. According to multiple retellings, there is a player named Stinkfist who split from one of the major powers and set out to awaken Karafurim, rallying at his side a smaller, trollish crew who just wanted to watch the world burn. So now they had this dilemma, and the top 3 competing guilds did really the only thing that they could do. They stopped fighting each other, and they marched together into the tomb. The Wardens were slain for one final time, the seal was broken, Karafurim woke up, and he proceeded to delete people as scripted. However, the Alliance did have an ace up their sleeve.
Okay, Homer, nothing to be worried about. Just...
He's only 6 seconds in. Attaboy, Homer! Keep dancing.
Persistence. The Alliance was so large, and they brought so many players, that they could resurrect the dead faster than Karafurim could kill them. In modern MMOs, dying is usually just a minor inconvenience. Maybe there's some durability loss, corpse run, but other than that, it's usually it. But this is, of course, not a modern MMO. This is old school gaming at its best or worst, depending on your point of view. And during this time, you weren't considered to be a true MMO if the player didn't want to throw their computer out the window after they died. So, in EverQuest, when you did die, you'd actually lose experience and even levels. So essentially, players were sacrificing combined years of time investment for a shot at making history. The fight raged on for hours, bodies hit the floor, then stood back up and hit the floor again. After about 3 hours of this, they had actually managed to take him down to a quarter of his health, and they began wondering, just what kind of loot does a supposedly unkillable dragon drop? That is, until the unimaginable happened. Karafurim vanished. The players were completely mystified. Some thought that they had killed him. Others thought that he glitched out and despawned, which was kind of true, because as it turned out, since he was designed to be unkillable, as the fight was going on, game masters actually got word of the spectacle, and they had suspected that the raiders were using a bug or an exploit, and so before they could claim the kill, they actually despawned him mid-fight. As you would imagine, people were fucking furious as hundreds of players at this point had sacrificed millions of XP and hundreds of levels in order to accomplish the impossible. They were essentially robbed from it, they flooded the forums, and the story quickly spread beyond the server and even the game, as it became one of the first viral moments within the MMORPG genre. However, there was some silver lining. The game masters eventually realized their mistake, and they respawned Karafirim in his tomb, so that the players could get another shot. And now that they knew that it was indeed possible, they launched another war of attrition on this unending conveyor belt of players sacrificing XP and levels for glory. Finally, after hours of fighting, and this time with no GM interference, the sleeper took a more permanent slumber. As some had suspected, disappointingly, there wasn't any loot to be had, as of course the game developers didn't account for the Draken actually being killed. But for many, the loot wasn't even really the point. The real reward was fame, creating one of the most legendary and crazy moments in the history of the MMORPG. So concludes another episode. Yeah, I know the title says World of Warcraft, but that was a cool story, so I do want to conclude all of these with other interesting moments from other MMOs, because that's what makes the genre interesting. But as usual, both inside and outside the world of Azeroth, we're just getting started, so check back soon and revel, laugh, or possibly cringe at the craziest moments in World of Warcraft's history.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.